Okay, so greetings everyone, and thank you, Professor Grovogui, for joining us all the way from Ithaca, New York. Before I introduce our distinguished guest on behalf of the local organizing committee, I would like to thank the South African Association of Political Studies for giving us, Rhodes University Political and International Studies Department, this opportunity to host the South African Association of Political Studies, SAP's 15th Biennial Conference 2021. I would also like to thank the broader organizing committee. The dates for the conference are from the 26th to the 28th of August. The conference programs, Zoom links, and other information about the conference are available on our social platforms. So today we're joined with Professor Grovogui. He's an international relations theory and is a professor of international relations theory and law at Cornell University in the United States of America. He's also the Nelson Mandela visiting professor in the Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University for 2020 and 2021. Professor Grovogui is an authority on international relations theory, political theory, and African thought. He's the author of Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, Africans, Race and Self-Determination in International Law, and Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Memories of International Order and Institutions, as well as many other articles and books, chapters on statehood, sovereignty, international law, and order. Professor Siba Grovogui was born in Guinea. He did his undergraduate in Guinea. He further pursued his master's and doctoral degrees in political and international studies with a minor in international law from the University of Wisconsin. He also has a law degree from Guinea, where he served as an assistant judge in the late 20s. Thank you, Professor, for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. I think the most important thing that the academics and scholars who are attending the SEPS conference really want to know is they just want to know a little bit more about yourself. So to give you context, one of my lecturers said that he would have been a basketball player, a professional basketball player, if it wasn't for politics or for his love for teaching. Another one should have said that they would have been a farmer. But what about Professor Grovogui? Tell us a little bit more about yourself. What, you were traveling over the summer. How was it like?
How was it like? My travel over the summer, or what would I have been if I wasn't doing this?
Yes. What you would have been if you're not doing this? Maybe you like traveling or...
No. My father was a labor organizer in Guinea before independence. So he was in the nationalist movement in the rainforest in Guinea, though he himself didn't have much education. But because I was from the rainforest and I was in a small town when I was growing up, actually what I wanted to do first was I was thinking that when I grew up I would be a priest, a Catholic priest.
Okay.
And obviously that didn't pan out, and now I'm still preaching because I'm a teacher. So for me, being Catholic priest or judge or a teacher is all in the same line. I always knew that I was going to do something that involves people's minds, right?
Yeah.
Because I saw my father very involved with people, and so that was always, I was always going to do something like that. I wasn't going to do math, physics, and etc. Though I was good at it, I wanted to be with people in some fashion.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you very much, Professor. So what are your current research interests at the moment?
At the moment, I have 2 book projects. One, I just finished the final chapter. It's being edited. So that should be going out soon. And the other one, I wrote 3 chapters on, was the book that I was writing. And then I realized that I needed to write 1 book first before the one I was really writing. The book I just wrote, that I just completed, which is now being edited. I haven't sent it to publishers yet, but because it's still being edited, right? is called The Gaze of Copernicus, but the real title is Post-Colonialism, Serendipity, and International Relations. And it is a story about why our discipline has been wrong about the world in the first place. And having been wrong about how the world was made, why our discipline, international relations, is incapable of leading us to where we need to go today, given all the crises that we are facing in the world. Right? And so that's what I needed to write. The reason I needed to write that was that I had started a book about African thought in the diaspora, historically speaking, around the questions of humanism. And my second book that you talked about, Beyond Eurocentrism, this other book I'm talking about was connected to that, right? Beyond Eurocentrism was to say, you know, we have to think about the world differently. And so this book, which I was writing, and I wrote 3 chapters, I set aside to write this one, Gaze of Copernicus. I wanted to write about Black people and how they have thought about themselves in the world, right, throughout the modern age. And so it starts with Quilombo de Palmares in Brazil, who were the first people to free themselves from slavery and establish their first state in the New World. And the reason we don't talk about them today has to do with questions of race, of class, of status. It also has to do with how we read history and we do historiography. And finally, it has to do with our own philosophical conceit that Africans don't think for themselves. And that book begins with Quilombo in Brazil. It comes to the Haitian Revolution, and then it visits anti-colonial and decolonization movement in late 19th century to early 20th century. And then it goes to Africa, and it ends, yes, it ends at the Rivonia trial in South Africa. That's where the book ends.
Okay.
It's going for Quilombo 1605 and ends at the Rivonia trial. There is a particular way in which Africans have seen themselves in the world. And how they have handled themselves and other people, how they have managed with suffering, enslavement, colonialism, etc., and how they have overcome that can be traced to particular ideas throughout 4 centuries. The reason we don't know that there is a species of political thought, thinking, a manner of thinking ethics that is proper to Black people, not because of our skin coloration, but because of the material conditions in which Black people have lived. The reason we don't live that is that we think that Africans have only suffered pain, humiliation, and etc., but had not thought throughout about their own particular condition. Right?
Yes.
But in order for me to say that story, I had to write this one book to say, forget about your discipline because it is incapable of comprehending the world. Before I actually say this particular slice of the human story, which being Quilombola and in Rivonia, sorry, not beyond, just Rivonia, right? That's where it ends. Because after that, Nelson Mandela, the end says I have become something else, but that's not my story. I'm not writing about politics. I'm talking about international relations. Yes. So those are my projects.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. So, you know, you raised an important part, which is South Africa. And, you know, a couple of weeks, months ago, there was violence and protest in South Africa. And to an extent, we can link those violent protests to apartheid as well. But from an international relations scholar, what can you see or what can you say about the post-colonial state, especially South Africa, with evidence of those looting and violence that was happening?
Yeah. As an African, of course, that concerns me greatly. I come from Guinea, where Miriam Makeba lived for 13 years with a bunch of other South Africans. They lived in Guinea, in my home country, right? So South Africa for me is a very personal question because I grew up at the university with Miriam Makeba nieces and some of her singers, dancers. They were all with us, all right, in college. Actually, like we were in the same classes. So that's the part. But to go back to apartheid, you see, you can, in the post-colonial African state, we have a lot of crises, and obviously we have to attend to those crises as they occur politically within the confines of the politics of whatever country you are in, right? But globally speaking, and I want to pull back a bit, the reason I tell people that young Africans that you should study international relations is that to the extent that international law and international relations provided a foundation for conquest and colonization, for our enslavement, from our expropriation, right? For even allowing that routine violence against Black people is okay. Then we have to accept the idea, or we have to at least consider the idea that of studying international relations, because until the larger world is fixed, our problems are not fixed. So we have to be invested in how the world happens, right? How the world works, I'm sorry. I give you an example. We start to the land question throughout Africa. After decolonization, right?
Yes.
Every African state said in their constitution that land belongs to the state, right?
Yes.
Mahmoud Mamdani has written some of those in Citizens and Subject and etc. My first book, Sovereign Quasi Sovereigns and Africans, also about that, right? Because Europeans had assumed that Africans have no relationship with their environment that could be construed as property. So they could take it, right? If we go to French-speaking Africa, right?
Yes.
They speak with a funky French accent. You know, the French. How did land become state property in France? After the revolution, the French took the land from the clergy, from the monarchy, from the nobles, and said, it belongs to us to distribute to the people. You cannot deprive people of access to the resources of life. Right?
Yes.
So you become independent and you mouth this as if it was God-given right to say land belongs to the state. No, land belongs only to the people. Why are you taking it away? The French took it from the noble and the monarchy that confiscated it to give it to the people. Here you have the people have it. You are taking it away from the people. Have your head checked first. And secondly, behind that, there's actually a profound insult that we do not know how to manage resources. We don't know how to manage our environment and etc. Right?
Yes.
So South Africa is only an iteration of that. It manifests itself differently in different places. I was just giving you the context of Francophone Africa.
Yes, yes.
Right? But so in a lot of cases, if you look at the land question assembly with the policies of the day, the whites have taken this or colonial powers or whatever, Then you localize the problem, and as long as the problem is localized, we have a great deal of violence. What we need to think about, and this is why I'm writing my book, is that there's a profound thinking we have to do with what it means to be a human. Where the human can deprive, what can some human deprive other humans of? Right? If you look at the French, American, and Haitian Revolution, that was the debate. This debate goes way, way back, right? You can't undo history. Whites are everywhere, Indians, we are everywhere. Everybody, I'm in America, right? But at some point, you have to ask, what do you see when you look at another human being? The Haitian Revolution decided that we are all equal, no matter our race, no matter our gender. Children and parents are equal in some fashion, though parents still retain the power to discipline, etc. Right? The Haitian Revolution was the most profound of all the revolutions because it says that the old free, meaning the whites, and the new free, meaning the slaves, have to have equal accesses to the resources of life. Right? Anti-colonialism and anti-slavery and anti-apartheid, all of them were about, correcting that old imperial and colonial contempt that other peoples needed less to live, and some people needed less to live, and some people needed more. Right? That the requirement of life for Black people is not that significant. You live in your hut, in South Africa, the homelands, or in Guinea, in whatever. That should suffice for you. We need the big mansions and the air conditioners and our children, right? That's a profound philosophical question. If you reduce it to he's black, white, he's black, this is why he's doing this, and etc., you have missed the boat. Our own global political economy is structured around the notion that some people require less and others require more. Right?
Yes.
But at the end of it, it's not new. The father of modern science, Francis Bacon, was also commissioner of torture. This is 17th century. Even in his time, they decided that torture should be the exception for white people because white people feel pain differently. Black people, it's okay to keep them permanently in a state of physical, right, pressure, torture, literally, because they don't reason. They feel our bodies are constituted differently. So what is an exception for white people who have transgressed against king, church, and empire? For Africa, it had to be a common condition of existence. So African bodies can live with a certain amount of pain, and that is okay. So this idea that reason, bodies, all of them, you put them together, psyche, that they are shaped differently for white and black, even though we don't say them today, in our laws, in our constitutional orders, that's what we are still replicating. We still imagine that it's okay to kick black people off the land, take the land. They don't know how to make use of it anyway, and that they can live with very little. That's okay. They should be happy. Right? So, at the end of the day, it has to do with how we see other human beings and how history, the material condition of life, its political economies have conditioned us to live and not let live. To want to live for us and not let live other people, even if we don't kill them anymore. But letting them live is not something we are obligated to do.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
What's funny?
No, thank you so much, because you've raised a lot of important things that we're actually going to discuss about. So you've discussed Africa's place in the global economy, but you have also discussed the land question throughout Africa, and the land question throughout Africa. I'm going to come to that because I want to link it to this project that you are involved in called the Chad Pipeline Project.
Yeah.
Yes. So So before we move on to that, I want to ask, so, how can we make African theories or Afrocentric theories mainstream in international relations? Because when students or when young academics are studying international relations, even on the African continent, we are mostly using realism. We're mostly using liberalism.
I don't.
Yes. So is it because we are not exposed to academics who introduce us to African theories, or is it because there are no African theories? Can you? Yes.
You said multiple things, and I have to take them one by one. After the 17th century, knowledge was organized into disciplines, and disciplines were predicated on a certain number of practices, and then they had canons, and then they had archives, and etc. Right? So yes, if you are young African in the academy in America, you can get easily lost. I'll give one quick example. In what Americans call the Ivy Leagues, the oldest universities in North America, right? I personally was the first Black person in the discipline of international relations in them. They had a lot of Black people, both African and non-African, but they were all doing comparative politics, history, anthropology, because they have imagined that we should mind our own little turfs, and they get to think about the world more globally, right? And so until recently, a lot of Africans, even because when they come to America, that's the second side of it, they also want to advance their careers and etc. So they have to play by the rules of the discipline. So who is Siba Grovogui? We don't know. But recently, they have celebrated my work at the International Studies Association meeting. They have done at University of Sussex. They have done all around, right, in many places now around the world, right? And that is a recognition of what I have been doing. But it's not. Nobody has ever celebrated me for knowing my realism and my liberalism very well. I am known personally for insisting that Black people have always theorized. And the reason that they don't know is not my fault, it's their own ignorance. Right? So I actually don't complain about people not knowing me. But anybody who's come across me in a panel knows to be very ready. Because I don't know if you know people who know me, they always tell you I'm not impolite, I'm not rude. But if I have to say, my friend, you know nothing, I will say that. Right? Because at some point, we have to stop complaining that people are not taking us seriously. We have to, that's my own goal, is to show them that their understanding of the world is actually what is lacking. And we are in the state in which we are today because they got to claim to manage the world and they knew the least about the world. Right? A friend of mine told me in France, his name is Touré, he's from Côte d'Ivoire. He told my friend, all the problems we have today in the world, he was exaggerating. It has to do with the fact that the country left standing after World War II, who had the money to fix the world's problem, was the country that knew the least about the world. He was talking about America, right? America is the birthplace of the modern discipline of international relations. They actually know very little about the world, right? But it's not also an American problem. Hegemons tend to know themselves and least about the people they claim to govern. Right? That's so. So our problem has multiple layers, and it's not just, you can't just say, well, you know, they are Eurocentrists and we are whatever. That's one thing. Secondly, it is not enough for Africans, and I want now to speak to Africans. It's not enough for us to just say, we don't like what you are saying. It's not enough. It's not enough for us to say we don't like what you are saying. If you were to be given the floor, what would you say? Would you continue just saying, well, your ideas are wrong? No. At some point, you actually have to say what those ideas are, which is what my second book project now, the one I told you was from Kilombo to Rivonia trial, is about. Right? But in that book, I do not concede that the Greeks are Europeans. Because from Diogenes, that's a Greek philosopher, 8 centuries after Diogenes, and you find that in St. Augustine book, the Confessions, every single Greek scholar spent time in Africa. I repeat, every single scholar, Greek, spent time in Africa. None of them went to France and lived there, right? And the French claim that the Greeks had their, genetically speaking, ancestors, the precursors to their own ideas, and Africans have no connection to the Greeks. No, the Greeks came to Africa to learn about Africa, and Africans went to Greece to learn about Greeks. This is not North Africa of Arabs. This is before the Arabs, right? If you go to West Africa also, the Moors, black people, conquered Spain and colonized it. While they were in Spain, if you read your books, you have something called the Andalusian Experiment, where, you know, philosophers, Jews, Christians, Muslim philosophers got together, and that's connected to what people call the Arab Renaissance or Renaissance, if you're whatever. Yeah. But when those guys left Spain, after Spain you conquered and chased out the Moors, they ended up in a place called Timbuktu, and the same intellectual ferment happened in Timbuktu. Right? So, also, during the historical experiment that in the Indian Ocean, going from the Indian Ocean all the way to China, that people call the Silk Road, you could leave East Africa, this is northern part of Mozambique today, end up in China, without speaking anybody's language, we didn't have passport, without etc. You go through states, empires, caliphates, and etc. It is along these routes that we invented the caravanserais, the cafe culture caravanserai that became our modern hotels, the cafe cultures, and etc. It's also along these routes that we that the dragoman, something called the dragoman, gave us all our institution of diplomacy. Right? Africa has always been connected. We don't know it. That's our fault. But it's not just that, and my claim is not just that Africans were connected. It is that some of the ideas that moved the world were profoundly African. Some of the ideas that moved the world were profoundly African.
Okay, all right. Yes.
Yes. No, I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that. So, what advice can you give to young scholars then?
What advice?
Yes, can you give to young scholars? Because you mentioned that when you arrived in the US, you know, and I think that is something that I've actually seen, is that, you know, people tend to play by the rules of the gatekeepers, you know, and when you got there, you didn't play along to the rules of the gatekeepers. So what advice can you give to young scholars? Should they not be limited by gatekeepers? Should they go overboard?
It's not that straightforward. I told you earlier that I'm not rude, I'm not impolite.
Yes.
Right? Which means that part of what we do in the academy is actually show our wares. It is to show ideas and to prove them. Right? Sometimes that means that you don't don't show up and say, well, Africans. This, it is that knowledge practices are also forms of communication, right? Sometimes knowing very well what they do and are speaking about is actually a very good starting point. Okay. And I think that if anybody were ask me today, how did you survive? I would say it's because everybody knows that I know all of their stuff, but they are always surprised by what I tell them because they don't know it. Right? That's one thing. And so sometimes if I went to South Africa as a Guinean and I don't speak Zulu, yes, right? But somebody has to speak to me about Zulu culture, they would have to use English, right? Which means that ultimately they will use perhaps a concept in English that is neither Zulu nor a concept that is Pele, my language. So we have to go through this concept, right? And part of what we do is actually to wrestle with the concept itself so that we actually know where we are going, right? Concepts are like an empty vessel. They are not entirely empty because they come already stitched together in some fashion. But in our communications, what we do is to see the applicability to our own context, right? So if I enter a classroom and somebody tells me realism, right? Okay, I know that realism means that the material conditions of existence compel us sometimes to confront the question of war. I accept that. Right?
Yes.
But this is the thing. Gunpowder has been along for many centuries before we made automatic rifles. That's just that. Native Americans manufactured, they put poison on the top of their darts. They knew that if the poison were too strong, you will kill the person when you hit it. You hit them with your dart, right? But they never made it strong enough to kill somebody because they wanted to capture their enemies and talk to them. In the same fashion, when they shoot an animal, when the animal fails, if the animal is not what they wanted, if it's a baby or expectant animal, they'll leave it there, walk away, and a few hours later, the poison will go away, they will go, right? So killing, the man of killing, the sort of leaps that we make about our willingness to destroy people, their houses, their whatever, their land, their everything, so they cannot even cultivate way beyond that. From automatic rifles all the way to nuclear weapons. That involves a whole series of both disposition, outlook, but also philosophical speculation at a minimum understanding of the purpose of life, right? In all of those regards, Africans had different stands, right? In the New World, as in South Africa, the first European would not have survived if the people they found there had not told themselves that somebody who looks different, though I don't understand, but still stands up, has legs, and etc., moves like me, speaks like me, and etc., and therefore I should at least, at minimum, abide the fact that they would need the same resources that I do. And they gave each one of them land, place to stay, and etc. Then those people turned against them and became their conquerors. If you blame the people who were conquered, then you are mistaken. What you have to ask yourself is what made people do those things to people who hosted them in the first place, who didn't slaughter them because they had no food and they were in short on numbers and did not know where they were. Right? If you think revenge, you are mistaken, my friend, because then you have become something else, not yourself. Right? But we have to tell ourselves that underneath that, there were philosophical concepts about belonging, about sharing, about access, and etc. It's incumbent upon us to know what those were. That way, if you go into a classroom and somebody tells you a theory of justice by John Rawls, then you can say, my friend, you want to talk about John Rawls? Have a seat, and I'll tell you about John Rawls. Right?
Yes.
You know why I'm saying that?
No.
By the time Locke wrote 2 Treatises of Government, black people in the New World, Quilombos, had already established the very government he's writing about. It didn't come from a white person's head. That is just fantasy. But if you take it out of the mind and the mouth of John Locke, then you understand how rich the concept of self-government is. It's not just vote for me, I get elected, I take everything and screw you. Pardon my French. Right? Yeah. It's much more complex, and it's incumbent upon us to as Black Americans say in this country, represent. We actually have to say, we have to reclaim the world that was taken away from us and re-articulate what life should be about on this planet. Because for 4 centuries, we have been going the wrong direction.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much for this insight, because I think the example you just raised about the Quilombos, they'd already started writing about like types of governance.
They had already established a republic.
Yes, they had already established a republic. Like you're saying, I think it just shows that even what you're talking about in the beginning about the way our way of thinking has been structured, has been I don't know, we've just been used to a certain way of thinking that it has limited even our study of international relations. It is limited even our study of our own societies that we live in, because like you're saying, even studying South Africa, for instance, we are using concepts and theories that are foreign to us, but in the same African continent, we have theories that can be used to help us. Thank you very much for that. So before we move on to my favorite part of this, we have one more question from the academics and scholars that will be joining us for the SAPS conference. So the question is, thank you, Professor Grovogui, for joining us. Where do you think researchers in international relations have over-researched or under-researched, and what do you think is the way forward?
I actually thought that was my presentation, because my presentation on next Friday, will be, I want to use actually the context of Quilombo to talk about freedom, ethics, and morality, just to sketch out a bit how certain ideas and concepts have evolved among the African diaspora. Right? Sometimes we shouldn't pretend that we should do our own thing, right? Because our own thing is not our own thing. It's that their thing is not theirs, it is ours. They just took it and made something else out of it. It's not just our resources that people took from us. They even took away our own ideas. America would not have been created without the founders of America taking the ideas of the native they conquered, the Iroquois League. American federalism was inspired from Indians, the Indians they conquered. Right? If you look at your classrooms, every South African, especially at the University of Cape Town, when they write about hospitality, who do they cite? Derrida, right?
Yes.
And Levinas. People in South Africa are teaching African young boys and girls about hospitality and cosmopolitanism. And they go bring Derrida and Levinas in it by people who landed in South Africa in very small numbers and were let live and received. And they turned against them. The reason we don't actually want to say in the colonial concept, in the colonial context, what you see in the colonial context is that hospitality has a double edge. You let somebody in your house, they may turn against you. Right? And that's one dimension of it. The other dimension of it is to say hospitality is human. We once gave hospitality to somebody here. Let's contemplate what happened after that, I'm sorry. And then let's see what we owe ourselves, because hospitality is not simply, I came, you give me some. The people who are receiving and the people who are received all have obligation toward one another. The people who are receiving as human beings, seeing other human beings like the Huguenots in France, who were slaughtered, left France, and were looking for a life somewhere. Even if the South Africans did not know about it, they knew what they were fleeing. And they should have known what it meant for these people to receive them. Right? But the Africans who receive them should never relinquish their own practices, cultures, and habit and disposition. They shouldn't give that up. Right?
Yes.
They shouldn't give that up simply because the person to whom they granted it did not respond to it the way we expected them to.
Yes.
Right? Because it's not all of them who responded the same way. Right? Bayers Nade is not Frederick, whatever his name is, de Klerk.
Yes.
They are not the same people, but they are both white. Right? So how we relate among ourselves is actually far more complicated. But we will talk to those things much more profoundly, interestingly, if we started first in Africa and say, what were Xhosas and the Zulus thinking when they allowed these people in? What was that about? Because they were not just conquered at the beginning. At the beginning, they extended, okay, come here, here's food, you don't know what we eat here, etc. Right? So I don't begrudge somebody bringing Derrida and Levinas in Cape Town and showing their fancy words. I care that thought is not connected to our own experiences. And because thought is not connected to our own experiences, we are unable to find the means to better our lives together. And I mean white, black, everybody. Right? Because if we take the context of hospitality in the colonial context as a starting point, then we know what we owe one another. Right? Then we actually become closer, not farther away. But that closeness means that somebody must be willing to give up something so that other people might live, because they had been let live before. But both hospitality and cosmopolitanism are profoundly African. Right? And so that is my problem. My problem is, I did not say don't read Derrida or Levinas. Read them. Because they are talking about hospitality in different contexts, of merchant classes, of dispossessed Jews traveling the world, and etc., etc. We, on the other hand, the coin is slightly the other way, because we were at home, somebody came in, right? They did not ask us for hospitality, it was granted. It was granted, just as Native Americans here granted it automatically. Right? So we didn't have a Kant telling us, oh, this moral imperative, forget all of that stuff. It happened, now what? Right? And so, but that's thinking. This is not contempt. This is not how do I call it? It's not bitterness. It's none of that. It simply is looking at our lives as it presented itself to us. But that's what, as academics, we all want to know that. It is to talk about our lives as it's presented to us, not in the language of the street, not about the politics of today, or not in dispossessing, attempt to dispose one. It's simply to understand how our world came together and what drove them apart and how we bring them back together now that we're in the same place. But everybody is obligated to respond. Everybody is obligated to give up something. Everybody is obligated to understand that all human beings have the same desire, they have the same needs, and therefore the same requirement. Nobody, no human being should live the idea, which is contemptuous at some level, that the requirement of life for other people is minimal and therefore the kind of social arrangement we have is okay, because it's not.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. And to everyone, please come join us if you want to follow up on this great argument and position that is raised by Professor Grovogui on Friday next week. So, Professor, when I was doing a little bit of research about you, something came up. It's called the Chad Pipeline Project.
Pipeline, yes.
So, and previously when we were having a discussion, you raised issues about the land question throughout Africa, and I think also in the Chad Pipeline Project, I'm not sure if there's an issue of land, but I think I remember reading something about the issue of land among the people there in Chad as well. So yes. Do you mind just explaining to us what the Chad Pipeline Project is about?
I decided that before I retire, I have to write about the global political economy. And the reason I did the Chad project was really studied in its from the beginning, right? And going up all the way to the international order. The Chad Pipeline project was structured such that the World Bank was involved, the state, oil companies, and etc. And the World Bank even set up something called the Chad Advisory Group, academics from around the world to make this thing work. Right? But what happened at the bottom, obviously, bottom up is different. So I want to see these two understanding of the political economy. I wanted to see what it means for our world today, right? Why a project in which the World Bank invested itself so much, and all NGOs around the world invested them so much, collapsed so miserably. But I didn't go in after the collapse of the whole experiment. I went in at the beginning, before even the pipelines were laid down, and I was there for 11 years, because I wanted it from the beginning, because I was suspicious of all the grand theorizing around the political economy, and I was convinced that it was not going to work, right? So, as a good social scientist, I had my hypothesis. Yes. So I went there to see. So the Chad Pipeline Project studies the land question, question of government, question of community, question of justice, questions of transparency, questions of all of those networking. And I wanted to see really in the modern context of Africa, why is it that most of the development projects in Africa has failed? And I wanted to dispense with the idea that they are all failed because Africa is simply corrupt, because corruption is actually far greater in Europe that is in Africa. Though it's inexcusable. I agree with Desmond Tutu. It's inexcusable in South Africa, right? But that's a different question. But it's not because we are black. It's not because we do something other people don't do. It is that we have never actually studied, we have never paid attention to what economy means in the first place. In the Greek origin of the term, economy is managing the household, right? You cannot have an economy from above. It cannot land this way. Economies are actually, management from the bottom up. Right? It's the household, the community, it goes up, right? That doesn't mean that it's not linked like a boat is not that is not at sea, it's not linked to other, its position, the position of other ships don't matter because they do, otherwise they collide. But it is that certain things actually have to be material. And so we have mixed three things in the way we talk about development today. We talk as if capitalism, market, and development are coterminous, that they are interchangeable. Right?
Yes.
But they are not. There were markets before capitalism. And there will be markets after capitalism, as capitalism surely will end one day. Right? And development makes no sense if it benefits first and foremost those people who are coming in and not the people who are there, right? And what I'm saying is very crude, but it's based on a lot of complicated ideas about why I want there and the economy. But to come back to the land question, and this is where somebody at the World Bank says we are bringing the rule of law in Chad through the Chad Pipeline Project. The rule of law means introducing the concept of property, and those notions of property will be connected to contractual relations. Here's the deal. Chadians, Ngambai, which is a dialect of Sara, in Ngambai language, they have 11, not one, not two, 11 different terms that all refer to relationship between humans and the environment that can be understood as property, and that involves different kinds of relationships. If you bring in your privacy laws from the World Bank as conceived, you have flattened all of those. And if you flatten all of those, the conflict arising from that is spectacular, and not in the good way. Right? So instead of development, what you brought was chaos, social chaos. But you see, a lot of Africans, in their own stupid way, NGOs, had bought into this idea that the World Bank is bringing the rule of law as if we did not have rule of law, and property as if we did not have property. In fact, our understanding of property and humans' relations around property, land in particular, was far more complex, because these societies live in lands that produce very little and had to accommodate one another's need on land that was very dry and not very productive, right? So they develop all these concepts so as to accommodate. So it is our fault as Africans to just say land is communal. Land is communal. What does that mean, really? There were techniques of making that communalism work. We don't even study that. So we become ourselves too lazy. And that's what I did not want to do around Chad. I did not want to take the lazy route. I actually wanted to see if somebody had paid attention to the property question here, could everybody have managed better than they did under this new rule of law? Of course they would have. It's evident, but I wanted to study it on the ground. Right? That's what it's about, because my last word to people, if I have long life in Africa, is to tell them that we have to change everything, but two things first: the state and the economy. Otherwise, we are doomed, because the instrument, the machinery of the state, how the state functions is not for us. It's not good for us. And the economies, how they are structured, how we think about them, is not good for us. And for us, I mean Africans, white, black, Indian, everybody. Right? It's not, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. A couple of months, or I think last year, so I'm from Zimbabwe. So the Zimbabwean vice president, he was being asked why did the economy, why are you not, building the economy? What's wrong with building the economy? And his answer was, he said that when they gave us back the country, they never told us how to run the economy. So by them, he's saying when the colonialists, when they gave them back the country, he never told ZANU-PF or the new government how to run the economy. And you bring something that is important when you say that when you study the economy, you have to start from the bottom, because it seems like with the problem with the post-colonial African states is that when we talk about the economy, we talk about the top, and we always ignore the bottom. So I think, thank you so much for highlighting that. It's something that people need to be told and people need to be aware of.
Do you know who else knew that?
No, well.
Sam Moyo, the late Sam Moyo.
Oh, okay.
Did you know Sam Moyo?
Is it the same Moyo who has written about agrarian studies?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Who died in India in an accident?
Yes, I know Sam Moyo. Yes.
Sam Moyo was a friend of mine.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yes, and
so Sam Moyo and I talked a lot about that, which is why I was smiling, because he talked a lot about that.
Oh, okay, yes. So I've read a lot about Sam Moyo as well and Sam Moyo's work. So, and also you raise an important aspect about the land question, especially in Africa, because we are still having the same problem in South Africa right now about the land question, because even the politicians at the top, they're just giving this argument that land is supposed to be communal. But what is communal? And I think before we close, Professor, can you just elaborate on what you mentioned, that us as African states, we need to change the state machinery, we need to change the economy. Can you just elaborate on that as your conclusion?
As a conclusion, I just want to say that we are all human beings, and fundamentally, there's a lot that we share, but we live in particular localities. We have particular histories, we have particular resources, etc., right? The state is an instrument that was supposed to help us go to where we are going. But this is the thing about the modern societies. Modern societies are better explained by republicanism and revolution more than state formation, which is where people have gotten it right. Every modern society, if you look at America, why do they have the Bill of Rights? Right? If you look at the Third Republic in France, why did they introduce all those liberal laws? It is that everybody understands that the state is a useful poison. You want to govern yourself, but you tell somebody, I'm going to govern myself by giving you all these powers. If you don't specify that power, if it doesn't correspond to your needs, if it doesn't correspond to the material, spiritual, psychic conditions of the people among which you have this state, it becomes simply an instrument to crush you, because you are giving people guns, the power to make money, to tell you where to go, to take care of your health, and etc. Right? That is self-government. So the state is like the pill that you take when you have malaria, right? It's a useful poison. And until we understand the state as a useful poison, we will never be able to control that machinery, because you vote for somebody and they think that they are on top of you, right? But understanding the state as useful poison allows us to see how we can contain it. And that way, how we contain it to our own end is what we never thought about. We just thought that if you have states, then we are fine. De Klerk leaves, Mandela comes, Mandela Mbeki. That is not at all an interesting way to think about the state. In fact, we see in South Africa that it doesn't work. Because your constitution or the laws, everything is the same, and it's just the managers are different. Decolonization was not about giving ourselves different managers. It was to rebuild. It was not to give ourselves different managers. Black there may be, but that was not the point. Right?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Grovogui. This was a very enlightening conversation. you know, it was more than an interview because, whether believe it or not, I have a page full of notes that I've written, and I think even for people who are going to be watching this interview, you know, they'll have a lot to learn, and that will encourage them to come and to come to your panel to see your understanding and how you're going to educate us again. Thank you so much.